There's a certain kind of power in letting go. Not with anger, not with spite, but with grace. It's the quiet moment when you stop begging for clarity, stop chasing answers, and simply choose yourself instead. This isn't about games. It's not about making someone jealous or trying to manipulate a reaction. It's about fully stepping back into your worth and making peace with the fact that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. When someone takes you for granted, they don't expect to lose you. They expect you to wait, to hold on, to keep proving you're enough. But the moment you make them feel erased from your life, not with drama, but with silence and dignity, that's when the shift begins. That's when regret sets in. Because you're no longer the one trying to hold everything together. When you finally let it fall apart and you're not there to pick it back up, this isn't a story about how to hurt him. This is a story about how to find yourself again. And once you do, he will feel it. Not just your absence, but your evolution. And when that happens, don't be surprised if he comes running back, not because you disappeared, but because the version of you he knew no longer exists. When someone begins to take you for granted, they often operate under the assumption that you'll always be there, answering texts quickly, liking their photos, making time for them even when they don't reciprocate. Over time, they grow comfortable, perhaps even careless, assuming your emotional presence is guaranteed. But here's the truth. Nothing wakes a person up more than realizing they've been erased from someone's emotional world. It's not about blocking them or creating drama. It's deeper than that. It's about becoming emotionally unavailable in a way that is calm, confident, and silent. Because when you detach, not in anger, but in self-respect, they start to feel the absence they never thought they'd have to face. Emotional absence is one of the most powerful responses to being undervalued. People are often more shaken by what isn't said than by what is shouted. When your energy, attention, and reactions are no longer accessible, it forces them into a space of uncertainty. They begin to wonder, why isn't she texting me back? Why doesn't she watch my stories anymore? Why is she so quiet? It's in that quiet that the echo of their actions bounces back at them. They start to reflect, not because you demanded an apology, but because you created space for them to notice the cost of their neglect. What most people don't realize is how impactful it is to remove your emotional investment without saying a word. You don't need to post cryptic messages or try to make them jealous. That still shows you're emotionally entangled. But when you genuinely start to live for yourself, when you stop checking their status, stop initiating conversations, stop wondering what they're thinking, you shift the balance of emotional power. You no longer react. You no longer reach out. And in doing so, you're saying the most powerful thing you can say: you no longer have access to my world. They begin to notice your absence, not because you've told them to, but because their ego starts to ache in the silence. People who are used to having you there, even in the background, are forced to reckon with the emotional vacuum you've created. And that vacuum makes them uncomfortable. They don't know how to fill the space because they never expected it to be there. They were counting on your attention being a permanent fixture. And now that it's gone, they feel exposed, insecure, and uncertain. This isn't manipulation, it's clarity. You're no longer available for someone who wasn't willing to meet you where you stood. You're no longer validating them when they make half efforts. You're no longer staying emotionally invested in someone who only shows up when it's convenient. And that clarity is magnetic. When a person senses they've been emotionally erased, the panic begins. They might try to re-engage. They might start reaching out more. They might act confused or even pretend not to notice at first. But deep down, they do notice. And more importantly, they feel it. That feeling of being erased doesn't just sting their pride, it disrupts their entire narrative. Because people build stories around you. Stories where you're the one who cares more, the one who waits, the one who stays. But when you step out of that narrative and leave nothing but silence, you force them to rewrite the script. And that's when regret sets in. Not just for how they treated you, but for how blind they were to the value of your presence. This kind of emotional absence also requires strength. It's not easy to pull back when you still have feelings. It's not easy to choose silence when your heart wants closure or connection. But the difference is this: you're not doing it to get a reaction. You're doing it because you finally understand your value doesn't lie in being constantly available. It lies in your ability to walk away from situations that don't honor you. And when you do, something remarkable happens. You begin to feel lighter, your mind becomes clearer, you stop obsessing over what they're thinking and start focusing on how you're healing. You stop analyzing texts and start reconnecting with your life. That shift from being emotionally entangled to emotionally free is where your power truly lives. And in that space, you begin to rebuild yourself on your terms. Meanwhile, they're left in the silence, wondering, reflecting, regretting. And that regret isn't born from anger or bitterness. It's born from the haunting realization that they lost someone who was deeply present for them, someone who cared, someone who gave more than they were asked to. But now that you're no longer there, they're left with the echoes of what they took for granted. In the end, you don't need revenge. You don't need explanations. You don't need to prove anything. Your absence does all the talking. Your emotional detachment becomes the mirror they can't look away from. And as you move forward, stronger, wiser, and more self-respecting, they'll be stuck in a loop of reflection. They may come back, they may not. But by that point, you'll have already moved beyond needing them to. Because the person you've become no longer fits into the version of you they once knew. Erasing someone from your life is often misunderstood. People think it's about revenge, about making someone hurt the way you did. But true erasure isn't rooted in anger. It's not about punishing someone for failing to love you right. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself you gave away too freely. It's about standing up and quietly saying, I'm not going to let this define my value anymore. When you stop showing up for someone who took you for granted, you're not being petty. You're remembering your worth. There's a distinct shift that happens when you move from chasing to choosing. When you stop trying to prove your love, your loyalty, your value, and instead begin to hold your energy back for the people who actually earn it. That's not cruelty, it's clarity. You're no longer responding to breadcrumbs or tolerating inconsistency. You're no longer trying to get someone to see what was always right in front of them. You're simply done. And that is the most dignified form of detachment there is. People often think that cutting someone off emotionally has to be loud and dramatic, but the most powerful form of detachment is the quiet kind. You don't announce it. You don't post about it. You just stop offering them the one thing they never deserved: access to your inner world. You stop responding with urgency. You stop trying to explain your feelings to someone who was never really listening. See? You stop engaging in conversations that only go in circles. You stop giving them the chance to play with your emotions like a toy they only want when it's almost gone. You reclaim your power the moment you decide to stop being emotionally available to someone who never made you feel emotionally safe. That decision doesn't require a fight. It doesn't need a final conversation. Sometimes it's as simple as choosing to stop caring more than they do. You start to build a new kind of strength, not one that's built on proving yourself, but one that's built on no longer needing to. When someone senses that you've truly erased them, not out of spite, but out of strength, it shakes them, especially if they're used to you always being there. They can't believe the same person who used to light up at their texts, who would go out of their way to make them feel special, is now unmoved, unavailable, and uninterested. And that shift doesn't make them angry, it makes them reflective, because now they have to sit with the reality that they lost someone who loved them deeply. And they lost that person not because of one big mistake, but because of 1,000 small moments where they didn't show up. You didn't walk away to hurt them, you walked away because it hurt too much to stay. You stopped responding, not because you're playing games, but because the game was never fun for you to begin with. You stopped showing up because you finally understood that love should feel safe, steady, and mutual, not confusing and conditional. You stopped being available, not because you wanted to make a point, but because you were tired of making excuses for someone who never tried to understand you. And here's the part most people don't talk about. Reclaiming your power feels incredibly lonely at first. There's a part of you that still craves the connection, that still wants the story to end differently. There's a part of you that wants to be chased, to be chosen, to be apologized to. But power doesn't come from being chosen by someone else. It comes from choosing yourself even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when it feels like silence is the only thing holding you together. Over time, that silence becomes peace, and that peace becomes power. You start to see the situation for what it really was, not what you hoped it would become. You realize how much energy you spent trying to convince someone to see your value, when the real task was seeing it for yourself. That's when the healing begins. Not when they come back, not when they finally understand, but when you finally stop needing them to. The irony is, that's usually when they come back. Not because they've changed comfort, but because your absence disrupted their comfort. They come back not because they suddenly know how to love you, but because they hate the feeling of not being loved by you. And when that happens, you'll be in a different place. A place where you no longer need their validation because you've already given it to yourself. You've already outgrown the version of you that begged for crumbs, and you've become someone who waits for nothing less than the feast. That's what reclaiming your power looks like. It's not about making them regret losing you. It's about no longer regretting giving them the chance in the first place. You've moved from hoping to healing, from chasing to choosing, from longing to letting go. And in that process, you didn't just erase them, you rewrote yourself. Silence is often misunderstood. People think it's the absence of communication, but in reality, it's one of the most powerful messages you can ever send. When someone hurts you, disrespects you, or begins to take you for granted, your silence becomes louder than any angry words you could throw at them. Because silence says, you no longer get a reaction from me. It says, I've stopped trying. It says, you don't have the same place in my life anymore. And for someone who once had your attention, your laughter, your vulnerability. That silence becomes deafening. When you stop talking, when you stop texting, when you stop explaining yourself, you reclaim something far more valuable than any apology: your self-respect. You send the message that your energy is no longer free, that access to your emotional world isn't a right, it's a privilege, and when someone mishandles that privilege, you don't have to scream, you don't have to prove anything, you just stop speaking. And the void you leave behind speaks for itself. People notice when your voice disappears. They notice when your name no longer pops up on their screen, when your presence fades from their daily life. Even if they pretend not to care, they do. Because no matter how aloof someone tries to act, they were used to your energy. They were used to your presence, your kindness, your care. They were used to knowing you were there, even in the background. And when you fall silent, they lose that sense of certainty. It's in that silence that regret begins to creep in. At first, they might brush it off. Maybe they think you're just busy. Maybe they assume you'll come back. But when the silence lingers, when it stretches from hours to days to weeks, it starts to whisper truths they don't want to face. It forces them to look at themselves, to question their actions, to wonder what pushed you away. And that internal dialogue is far more haunting than any confrontation. You see, when you argue or beg or try to explain your hurt, you're still giving them your attention. You're still emotionally involved. You're still saying, what you think and how you respond matters to me. But when you go silent, you stop centering them in your world. You stop asking for their understanding. You stop needing their reaction. And that shift hits harder than any words ever could. Because silence isn't passive, it's intentional, it's a boundary. It's you saying, I choose peace over chaos. I choose dignity over drama. I choose me. And that choice unsettles people, especially those who relied on your emotional engagement to feel validated. When you stop reacting, they lose the control they once had. They can no longer manipulate your emotions. They can no longer spark conflict just to feel connected. They can no longer test your limits because you've drawn a line. In that quiet, you gain clarity. You begin to see things as they are, not as you hoped they'd be. You realize how often you over-explained yourself to someone who was never listening. You realize how many chances you gave to someone who thought you'd never leave. You realize that the peace you feel in your silence is worth more than the chaos you endured trying to make things work. And here's what often happens next. They reach out. They test the waters, a random message, a vague comment, a story reply. They try to break the silence to see if you'll still respond, not because they've changed, but because your absence makes them uncomfortable. They miss the comfort of knowing you were always there. They miss the ease of your affection. They miss being the center of your attention. But by the time they notice, you're already gone. Not physically, perhaps, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually. You've checked out, and no amount of small talk can bring you back. And when you do respond, if you ever do, it's different now. Your energy is measured, your words are limited, your warmth has cooled. Not because you're being cruel, but because the emotional door they once walked through freely has been locked. You're not the same version of you they once knew. You've grown, you've learnt, and you've found a new kind of power in not reacting. That's what silence gives you. It gives you space to heal, It gives you the room to reflect. It gives you the strength to detach. And most importantly, it sends the message that you no longer accept the bare minimum. That if someone wants to be part of your life, they'll have to do more than just show up when it's convenient. They'll have to earn your presence because you've learned how valuable it is. So, if you're wondering whether to send that message, to explain yourself one more time, to argue your worth, pause. Ask yourself what your silence might say instead. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. And in that nothing, you say everything. Regret is often misunderstood. People think it comes from your absence, from you disappearing or cutting contact. But the deepest regret doesn't come from losing access to someone's time. It comes from realizing that the version of you they once knew no longer exists. That the person who forgave easily, who tried endlessly, who showed up despite the pain, has evolved into someone stronger, more grounded, and no longer waiting. What haunts them is not that you're gone, but that you've grown. Growth is a quiet transformation. It doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't need to be announced. It begins the moment you stop asking why they did what they did and start asking why you allowed it to continue. It begins the moment you stop hoping they'll return and start wondering what it is within you that craved their attention so badly. It begins when you realize that the love you wanted from them had to begin with you first. And in that realization, you shift, you stop needing, you start becoming. When someone takes you for granted, they do so because they believe you'll stay the same. They think you'll always be the person who texts first, who makes excuses for their behavior, who lowers your standards just to feel close to them. But people forget that pain is a teacher, that betrayal is a trigger, that silence becomes fertile soil for rebirth. And by the time they wake up, by the time they feel the regret, the person they're looking for no longer exists. You're not that same version of yourself anymore. The version they had access to, the one who gave without boundaries, who accepted crumbs, who overextended, is gone. In their place stands someone who now values time, peace, and alignment. Someone who doesn't chase, someone who doesn't beg to be understood, someone who understands that love without respect is just control dressed in affection. That's what they miss. Not just your presence, but the ease with which they were once forgiven, the simplicity of your love, the generosity of your heart. But now, that generosity has been redirected towards yourself. And the irony is, they usually start to care when you stop, when you no longer light up at their messages, when you no longer ask how they're doing, when you no longer watch their stories or engage with their games. That emotional detachment unsettles them because it signals that you're no longer waiting, that you've started living, that the person they used to orbit around has found a new center of gravity, one that doesn't include them. They might come back, they might reach out. But what they're really trying to reconnect with isn't you now, it's the old version of you. The one who made them feel important, needed, powerful. And that's the trap most people fall into. They confuse their return with genuine change. But often, they're not seeking reconciliation. They're seeking the comfort they lost when you grew beyond them. When your boundaries became firm, when your standards rose, when your focus turned inward. They're not always ready for the new you, they just missed the old one. That's why it's so important to hold the line. Because growth doesn't just protect you from others, It protects you from falling back into patterns that no longer serve you. You've fought too hard to come this far. You've cried through too many nights. You've talked yourself out of reaching out too many times. You've rebuilt your self-worth, piece by piece. You didn't do all that just to be the same version of yourself when they come back. You did it to ensure that whether they return or not, you'll never return to who you were with them. And that's where regret truly begins to burn in them. When they see that you've outgrown the cage they built around you, when they realize you no longer seek their validation, when they understand that you now look at them not with longing, but with neutrality, that your heart no longer races, that your hands no longer shake, that your emotions no longer rise at the sound of their name, that's when they feel it. Not just the loss, but the permanent shift. Because it's not just about losing you, it's about losing the chance to love the best version of you, the one they never took seriously when they had the chance. And now that you've become even better, even stronger, they know they're no longer qualified to stand beside you. And that's a type of regret that can't be consoled with an apology or a late night message. It's the kind of regret that lives in the quiet corners of memory, echoing with what if and if only. Your job isn't to make them regret. Your job is to grow so fully, so confidently, that even if they do, it doesn't change your direction. Because your growth was never about them, it was about you. And the moment you understood that was the moment you began to heal. Not for revenge, not to prove anything, but to reclaim the life you paused while waiting for someone who never truly saw you. Now you see yourself, and that's what matters most.